Hello, everyone, and welcome to Neurocracy. Today, we're joined by Dr. Nikolaus Kriegeskorte, professor of psychology and neuroscience at Columbia University. His research asks how the brain enables us to see, combining neuroscience and AI techniques to understand how our visual systems can turn images into meaningful representations of the world. Dr. Kriegeskorte, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Sanjay.
Of course. So, my first question for you is how would you describe your research and what you're trying to understand about the brain?
Yeah, it's at the intersection of three different disciplines: cognitive science, computer science, and AI and neuroscience. And we're trying to develop theories that combine insights from all of these, right? So cognitive science is about studying human behavior and building computational models that capture at a high level the algorithms that the brain uses. And neuroscience is about contributing constraints to understanding these computational mechanisms by measuring brains directly. And AI and computer science is highly relevant because we are interested in theories that specify how the computations work, right? So these models that we're trying to build have to be AI models that can actually do the cognitive functions that we're interested in, right? So some people started to call this emerging field at the intersection of these three disciplines cognitive computational neuroscience. And this is quite a new development. It's been around for perhaps a decade or so. So there was a conference by that name that we founded in 2017, and it started in New York. It's coming back to New York this year. And this is where people from these different disciplines who are curious about combining the insights and building some bridges meet every year. And one thing that's important to understand about this endeavor is that we don't really have a mature methodology. So this is an emerging field between the disciplines. So, in a way, you could say we don't know what we're doing there. We're very excited because there've been these transformative developments, both in neuroscience. So the modern neuroscience revolution has given us much richer data about brain activity in animals and also in humans. We also have much richer behavioral data from web-based experiments and also from video analyses. So increasingly with modern computer vision and neural network models, we can use video to capture behavior in a much more detailed way as well. So that's the modern neurosciences data revolution. And then of course there's been the AI revolution driven by brain-inspired neural networks. And that gives us a lot of ideas about how computations might work in the brain, how intelligence is even possible, right? And we can use a lot of these advances in AI, including the hardware and the software platforms like PyTorch, automatic differentiation, and also some of the computational ideas to build models that have a slightly different goal from AI, right? In AI, you want to get things to work really well. And in cognitive computational neuroscience, you want to build models that at some level of abstraction capture how these computations work in brains, and in particular in the human brain.
Yeah, that's really cool. One of the things that I found really interesting there is you mentioned brain-inspired neural networks. So I'm curious if you could expand on that. Does that mean that our brain kind of holds secrets, perhaps, that are able to inform higher quality neural networks? Or I'm just a little curious in that.
Yeah. So, any two things, A and B, are similar in some respects and dissimilar in other respects, right? And so neural networks and brains are similar in some respects and dissimilar in other respects. And people have very different spontaneous responses to, the question of whether modern rate-coded neural networks are similar to brains, right? So my colleagues in the Department of Neuroscience, they really care about the biology. They study the cells, the ion channels, the morphology of cells, and the dynamics in particular cells and small networks of cells. And they may feel that, these abstract neural network models are not that similar to actual brains. They're missing a lot of the, dynamic repertoire of real brains, and that could be a computational limitation as well. But if you ask a cognitive scientist, cognitive scientists are happy to work with models that capture algorithms at a very abstract level, more in the language of computer science. And to them, using a neural network is a big step in the direction of having something that is more like a biological brain, right? So this paradigm shift in the 1980s in cognitive science when connectionism, this was like an early wave of interest in neural network models, and that started in cognitive science, and it brought cognitive science closer to neuroscience, although it was still so radically abstracting from a lot of the biology that it didn't really quite make contact with the neuroscience, right? And with cognitive computational neuroscience, we're hoping to, build a stronger bridge there, engage the biology more strongly. But there's still, all these levels of description. There's still a large gap between the level at which we can describe abstract cognitive processes and the implementation in our physical brains.
Yeah, it's really cool. One of the big things about your research seems to be around this topic of vision. So I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little bit about some of the questions that you're asking about vision and maybe like what approaches your lab is taking in those steps.
Indeed. And, I know that you're a speed cuber. You're
Yeah,
interested
I actually have one
in
right
Rubik's
here.
Cube.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you got this one. Yeah, this looks pretty cool. I also got a couple of cubes here.
Oh, are you a cuber as well?
Not really. I just
Oh,
thought like them as design objects.
oh
I
yeah.
don't even know how to solve the 3 by 3 by 3,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated with Rubik's Cube. I remember when I first learned about the cube, this was when I was a little kid, and it was a new invention
Yeah.
one year, and it was on a car ride that my dad described this new object to me,
Oh,
this,
okay.
that had never existed before. And he just described it while driving the car. He said, there's a cube, every in every direction it's sort of sliced. There's three slices, and then you have these 27 blocks, and then you can turn them and it doesn't fall apart. And it was just, totally mind-blowing to me that this could even exist,
Yeah.
like how you could have such an object that it like you can move all the pieces, but it doesn't fall apart, right?
Yeah.
Because this was beyond my imagination to really be able to judge whether that's even possible, right? If you told me about it and I didn't know if it's possible, I might say no, that will never work, right? Uh, so yeah, Rubik's Cube is fascinating, and maybe we can also use Rubik's Cube as a kind of example to think some of the questions through, right? Because you can think about the visual perception part of, solving Rubik's Cube, right? So if you want to solve it, maybe first you have to go to your room and you have to find your cube, right? And your room might be cluttered,
Yeah, I
what
do have a lot around my room actually.
you
Yeah.
might have more than one, but you have a lot of other things too.
Yeah.
So you need object recognition for that. That's something that we study. And you need to, for your object recognition to be robust to, all the changes in lighting and other objects that are present. And, you might find the cube in many different orientations, somewhere partially occluded or something like that, right? And these are the things that we want to understand. Until maybe like a dozen years ago, this was really not possible for computer vision, to do in general. If you just take snapshots of random scenes of your room and you want everything labeled, this only started working um, since the deep learning revolution, right? So it was these very naively brain-inspired models that led to these breakthroughs in vision and language in AI. And that's very very striking, right? That these very broad inspirations from the brain actually drove these engineering breakthroughs and kind of vindicated these early intuitions that you could argue were, maybe somewhat naive, right? Imagining a neuron as computing a linear combination and then doing a static nonlinearity. But this has really been somewhat vindicated, and that's pretty amazing. So let's think about this cube example. So how do you even find your cube? The cube can be in many different states, right? So the actual pixel patterns, because it has I don't know, 10 to the 19 different states, right? It always
43
looks,
quintillion, I think.
what is that?
43 quintillion. Yeah.
43 quintillion.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it always looks different, right? But something about it is always the same, and you need to have a visual system that can exploit these invariants, right? And so how that works is really interesting. And there's kind of two major intuitions about it, and neither of them explains how it works in the primate brain. The first intuition is that it's a discriminative process. So you take, all the image pixels and then you compute different kinds of features all over the image. So with convolutional layers of a neural network, and you go from an image-like representation to a representation that's kind of at an intermediate level where you still have a spatial or retinotopic map of features, but the features capture kind of parts of shapes, parts of objects, something intermediate. And then as you go higher and higher in a hierarchy of representations, you get to a level where it's more about the content, more about the objects than about the spatial layout of the scene. And in this way, you can do this sequence of feed-forward computations, and you can abstract, you can filter out all the irrelevant information, like, where exactly are the yellow labels on the cube. That doesn't matter for, finding the cube. But, the edges of the cube, and that is a cube, these features that indicate that they are very useful for finding the cube in your cluttered room, for example, right?
Yeah.
And so you can have this network of feed-forward computations, and that can get you all the way to kind of a map that highlights where are your cubes in your cluttered room, right?
Okay.
And this is something that, computer vision has shown. You can build it that way, and that works, right? There's also another way of thinking about this, which is more motivated by thinking about the problem from first principles. And so this is a normative perspective where you say, okay, the image, that's the data, and I want to make the best possible inferences from these data, right? So I should bring these data, I should interpret these data in light of everything I know about the world and about the cube, right? So I have to have this generative model of all the possible images that I might see. And in that model, I have parameters that describe the current scene in front of me, like your room, right? And it would describe all the objects, where they are, what orientations they are. And then from that, you can generate an image, like imagery. You could close your eyes, you could imagine a possible view of your room. And then you have to find the set of parameters that matches the image that you're actually perceiving, right? And more generally, not only do you have to find the best match, but ideally you would infer a posterior over all possible states of all these parameters, the joint distribution over all the parameters that describe the scene, right? So this is kind of like a Bayesian inference, a normative perspective. This is sort of what you should do if you wanted to use this retinal impression as well as possible, right? Like this is what probabilistic inference prescribes. That's known to be the right thing to do. The only problem with that is that it's very expensive computationally. It's usually not at all realistic to do what Bayesian inference and Bayesian decision theory prescribes. And so the brain has to find some shortcuts. Another way of thinking about this is that this is the thing you should do if the only limited resource were data, right? You have data, you want to be efficient with your data, but actually there are other limited resources that the brain is, our brains and other brains, animal brains, are subject to. For example, constraints on space. You can't have an infinitely big brain. Constraints on time. You have to, recognize where it is pretty quickly. You don't want to be, churning along for half an hour just to analyze a single visual impression that you get. And then also energetic constraints, right? So computation is actually costly, right? So I remember as a kid, I was, thinking about calculators, right? You have these calculators that have a little battery in them and they can go forever, right? And you think like, where do they get their energy from? Why do they work for so long, right? And you think, well, it's just you can scale down the amount of energy you need because you just need to process the information, right? So you kind of scale it down to, very little energy and you can still do all the computations in the calculator. However, as the computations get more and more complex, actually energy becomes an issue, right? And for AI today, energy is a huge issue.
Yeah.
And, people are thinking about building additional nuclear power plants to provide the energy
Or even
for
like the data
AI.
centers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the human brain works on about 20 watts,
Yeah.
right? So this is one of the big remaining secrets of, how is it possible for the human brain to make these inferences so robustly and so efficiently with so little energy, right? This is really a complete mystery, I think, also for engineering, how it's even possible, right? So for cognitive computational neuroscience, the mystery is how does our brain do it? And for engineering, the mystery is how is it even possible?
Yeah. I guess one of the things that I've read about, like in my understanding of neuroscience, is the fact that the brain, like the neurons, are coding in continuous changes of voltage, whereas computers are holding information in binary. So that is one of kind of like the piece of evidence I've heard for like a partial explanation for why the brain is able to consume less energy than what like a computer model of its same caliber would have to consume. So, or do you have any
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
I think that is a very important thought. Of course, spikes are also binary in a sense, right? But
Yeah, yeah,
not quite in the same way that computation works in computers mostly, right? So analog computation is a fascinating area, and eventually, I think if we want to implement neural networks in a really efficient way, we're probably gonna need some different hardware implementation, like neuromorphic hardware. It could still use electricity, but analog computation would probably be an important aspect of that, and it's going to be really fascinating.
okay.
So maybe let's talk a little bit more about the cube. So we've talked about, like how you find your cube in your room and how there's this tension between this discriminative approach where you just have this kind of feed-forward sweep of maps being computed from the image, and then maybe you have a map that highlights where the cube is. Um, but of course, you also want to be playing with the cube, solving the cube, right? And this is really where we have to think not just about perception, but about cognition and about action, right? And close the perception to action cycle. So let's imagine, how would we study that in cognitive computational neuroscience? And this is actually like a fascinating potential research program. Let's say if you wanted to join us in cognitive computational neuroscience, you could say, okay, my research program is all about fully understanding how people solve Rubik's Cube, right? This would be a great research program. Um, I think there are some studies. I know Tom Griffiths has worked on some related things recently, but I don't think anyone is really pursuing this. Um, so this is interesting because it's kind of different from what we are doing in our lab, right? In our lab, we're dividing and conquering in a different way. We're saying, okay, there's the perception to action cycle, but we're focusing on visual perception, right? So we're basically saying we're focused on a part of the brain that we think performs a part of the cognitive functionality that the brain needs. And we're trying to study that in isolation, right? And this is a pragmatic choice, and it's necessary to, make your research question more narrow so you can actually come up with good experiments and you can make some, semi-rigorous conclusions from your empirical data. So that's very important. But at the same time, of course, it's also in a major way wrong, right? Because all vision is embedded in interaction, right? And if you're talking about vision during solving the Rubik's Cube, right? You're looking at it, you're moving it around, your motor control is part of the process at all times, right? And also your perception leads you to move the cube in order to bring, some of the occluded surface to your eyes, so you have a richer picture of the whole of the cube, right? Otherwise, you would necessarily forget parts of it because your working memory is limited, right? So basically, the whole process of solving it involves, in a very dynamic way and at quite a small time scale of, really fractions of a second, the whole perception to action cycle, right? And that's really a fascinating part of it too. So, if I were to start over, I might consider maybe I shouldn't focus on vision. Maybe I should, instead do this dividing and conquering by focusing on one task, right? And that could be the Rubik's Cube, and then I'd study the whole perception to action cycle, but just in that one task. So I'm still dividing and conquering, right? I'm not trying to understand all of cognition, but I have this kind of more tractable, more focused empirical object, which is, how do people solve Rubik's Cube?
What would be some of the methodology you would predict like one would use if they were to go about like studying the perception action cycle?
Exactly. Yeah. So fascinating thing would be that there would be extremely different processes involved. The visual piece, right? How do you get from the retinal signals to a mental percept of the state of the cube, right? And what is that? What is the format even of that mental representation? Does it fully represent the cube? I think, if I look at the cube, it certainly does not fully represent the
Oh yeah.
cube. If you take it away and you ask me, what was that, I'd get everything wrong, right? And I'd certainly not represent any of the occluded part of the surface.
Yeah.
Probably when you see it, since you're a speed cuber, there'd be more information in your brain, right?
There's like certain like artifacts, like for example, like a corner edge that may be connected will grab my attention. There's like different kinds of units that I'll probably remember specifically. I probably wouldn't remember like pieces that are kind of like arbitrary, in a
Mhm.
sense. But for example, if I were to scramble this, like for example, like this connected bar right here, I would
Yeah,
definitely remember that, for instance.
yeah.
I might not remember this piece per se, but things like there would
That's
be
interesting.
certain like
Yeah. So
yeah.
certain things are going to be salient to you, and why are they salient? So they could be you've somehow learned to attend to them, right? And so probably the things that would be salient to me would be different from the things that would be salient to you. And I would expect that your saliency is more aligned with what you actually need to solve the cube because you know how to solve the cube, unlike me, right? So you know what you need to attend to. what subset of the information you really need, right? And that's all about doing this with limited resources, right?
Yeah.
And so one reason the cube would be fascinating is because it's kind of in a sweet spot. It's not sort of a computational mystery, right? So the cube has a lot of states. We said, what did you say? 4.3 quintillion,
43 quintillion. Yeah.
43 quintillion. So that's a lot of states, but it is, you can think of it as a graph, maybe an undirected graph with 43 quintillion nodes, and then you have a limited number of moves, right? So maybe the front and the back and the top and the bottom and the left and the right, and you can turn 90 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise. So you have sort of 12 edges from each node to each other node. And this graph is perfectly symmetric. So every node looks like every other node, right? It's one of the beautiful things about this. So, of course, this has been studied, and computer scientists know how to, solve the cube. It is very big. So, I think naive search for, the shortest path, like the smallest number of moves to solve the cube, is probably not realistic. But there are algorithms, and it's very interesting to think about, how a computer scientist would approach this problem. Because of the sheer size of the state space, even a computer scientist would have to think seriously about how to do this efficiently in terms of memory and in terms of time, right? So you'd be thinking about heuristic methods for solving the cube, where you're searching some kind of heuristic breadth first search or iterative deepening A star or something like that. Or maybe you have sort of subsets of states, and you have like different levels of abstraction where you first get to the right cluster of states, and then you're closer to the solution, and then you can get to the solution. And so it's really fascinating because it's not a computationally trivial problem. There are lots of ways to approach it. And some of these ways are going to be more similar to how the human brain does it than others, right?
Right.
And how the human brain does it is also a mystery, right? So there's a real thing to be discovered there. So if this were our research program, we'd first want to have a lot of models, or a number of models that can actually do the task, right? So first we have to learn the computer science of this. We have to know, okay, there's this range of algorithms, and these have different pros and cons, and this is how they work. And we have to think about how might they be implemented in neural networks? How can we use neural network components, right? And this is where we would probably think about the end-to-end control problem of solving the cube, right? Like how can you integrate the perceptual component with the action component, right? And putting these pieces together is really fascinating because, like, in our minds, now that we're talking about it, like the way that I'm speaking about it is very limited because actually the perceptual part and the cognitive part and the manual manipulation part are sort of falling apart. I'm not talking about them in a properly integrated way. That would be more sort of a better starting point for understanding how our brains actually solve this, right?
Yeah.
But you can think about how you would set up a neural network-based AI system to actually solve the cube with a robot hand, right? And robot hands can manipulate cubes, right? One thing that's kind of a fascinating lesson from the history of AI is that hard problems are easy and easy problems are hard. I'm sure you've come across this, right? So in a sense, when we look at the cube, maybe we admire people like you who can actually solve the cube. But from an engineering perspective, the harder thing is the perceptual and the motor manipulation part of it, right? Like the fact that you can with your hands, move the cube so fast, this is beyond current AI completely. Whereas finding some path, to the solution is basically like a homework project for a computer science student, right?
Yeah.
So what we admire, the cognitive feats we admire in others, like playing chess or doing puzzle games or even doing math, doing symbolic math, proving something, these happen to be the things that are often to do with discrete states and symbols. And these are the things where some of us are highly trained on them, and therefore they're much better than some other people.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what we are, that's very salient to us about human intelligence. But the things that are actually computationally or from an engineering perspective, the most difficult are things that, even a primate, even a monkey can do, right? Like you open your eyes and you have this rich impression of the world around you. You see all the things in it. You can understand the relationships between them at a glance. These are really some of the mysteries, even to current engineering.
Yeah. One of the things that came up like a little earlier in our conversation was this idea. Well, an idea in my head is one of the things I've come across in neuroscience is the idea of a dorsal stream versus the ventral stream for visual processing. And for anyone who doesn't know, I believe the dorsal stream is the um, where like the object is kind of, and it's a lot quicker, I believe. And then the ventral stream is more towards the temporal lobe, and it's kind of like the what of the object. And it might be a bit slower. I was curious if you can maybe elaborate on how vision kind of relates to these parallel processing, like visual streams.
Yeah. So the ventral stream and the dorsal stream are kind of like two major parts of the visual system, and they're kind of quite large, each of them, and separate spatially, but extremely interactive, right? And if you have these kind of two parts, you try to understand how are they different, right? And you find that the information represented and the format in which it's represented is not identical. Although, you might be able to, if you show people images and then you measure brain activity in the dorsal stream and the ventral stream, and then you try to decode from that brain activity what people were seeing, you can usually do that to some extent from either the ventral or the dorsal stream for overlapping sets of information, right? So this is not like a completely clean division.
Mhm.
But it's also not true that these things are just all the same and it doesn't matter where you record from, right? In some regions, and this is also true at a finer scale, like along the ventral stream, you have different regions and they have functional specializations and they reside at different levels of an abstraction hierarchy. So because they all draw from the visual input, they represent overlapping sets of information to some extent, but they may focus on different subsets of the information, and they also may represent the information in different formats. And this is really something that fascinates us a lot, how the format in which something is represented affects what you can easily infer from it, right? So there's two famous expressions of this. So different representations may be informationally equivalent without being computationally equivalent. I think Herbert Simon said it that way. And that means, you have two representations. They contain the same information, meaning you can compute the information in this one from this one and vice versa, right? So the information content is the same, but the way it is represented is very different, right? So to get an intuition for that, you could think of a map, where you have everything laid out in 2D space as it is laid out in the world. And that's very useful when you want to get an overview of the scene and maybe plan a path for navigation. And you could take the same information and just represent it in a list where, you have the coordinates of all the objects, right? And from that list, you can draw the map, and from the map you can make the list. So you have the same information, but computationally they wouldn't be equivalent because some things are really obvious from one of them, and other things would require a lot of computation to get to, right? And
Yeah.
so this is, I think, a very basic insight. So we're very interested in how these representations change as the information is processed, right? And there's basically only two things that can happen. You can filter out information, you can obliterate some of the information in the input and not represent it, right? And that can be useful because not everything is important for your behavior, right? So you might want to leave it out. There's nuisance variation, right? So for example, there's all these things that change about the appearance of an object, given how the lighting currently works, whether there happens to be a shadow, all these things, they are less relevant. So maybe you want to either de-emphasize or ideally filter out, although that may be difficult to do cleanly, this information. And then the other thing that you can do is change the format in which it is represented, right? So you can think of computation as the transformation of representations from one format to another, and of eliminating information. You cannot add information in the sense of mutual information between the input and the representation because of the data processing inequality, but you can remove information, you can change the format. So we look a lot at what we call the representational geometry. So you present a bunch of different images, and then you look at the population neural response patterns, and you compare the response pattern for each of the image to the response pattern for each other image. And then you get the square matrix of how similar these neural representations are. And that defines what we call the neural population representational geometry. So this is the distance man. You can think of like the multivariate response space where every response pattern is a point in that space. And the distance matrix defines all the distances between them. So, if you have the distance matrix, you have this sort of rigid arrangement of points where each is a neural response pattern. And that tells you a lot about what distinctions this brain region cares about and what distinctions the brain region does not care about, right?
Yeah.
So for example, if you were looking for your Rubik's Cube, I would guess that, at some level of representation in your brain, the representation would not care about what the colors are, it would only care about the differences between a cube and a different object, right? And then when you pick up the cube, you need a different kind of representation, and ideally a representation that gives you a sense, for example, of how scrambled is this cube, right? Because you want to be moving toward a less scrambled state, right? So one kind of naive idea for an algorithm for solving the cube would be you learn to perceive how scrambled the cube is, and then you learn to find actions that make it appear less scrambled, right?
Yeah.
So, this sounds attractive. If someone tried to implement this, I'm sure it would fail spectacularly because it's a little more complicated than that, and if you had a naive notion of perceptual scrambledness of the cube, probably if you would plot that along the path that you take when you solve the cube, you might be going back to a more scrambled state.
Yeah, that is true.
Right?
Yeah.
It would not be monotonic.
Yeah.
But a lot of what learning to do this is about is getting a better, a more sophisticated sense of this, right? So even perceptually, that allows you to kind of naturally see the bigger picture, right? That, two cubes, for example, if I asked you, how close are these 10 cubes to the solved state, right? And then someone asked me, we would probably rank them differently, right? Because you could see, oh, yeah, this one looks more different, but actually, you just have to make these composite moves, and then you've solved it, right? And so how we acquire these representations that really support the computations, that is a fascinating a fascinating question. And the human brain and the primate brain is incredibly good at being plastic in this way and conquering complicated and totally novel tasks like Rubik's Cube in this way, despite the fact that Rubik's Cube has not been around for most of our evolution.
Yeah, that is true. I always find it interesting how our brains are able to pick up new skills, and especially like sometimes I look at videos of myself solving it. I'm like, oh wow, it's interesting that I'm able to like turn it that fast or process something quick. So, I always marvel at the capability of our brains. Um, my final question for you is looking ahead, what questions in your field are you most excited to kind of tackle, or what questions are kind of maybe on the other end, like really annoying right now? Just yeah.
Yeah, so one thing that's really important to me is to think at all levels about cognitive computational neuroscience. Like, is this even possible, right? So in the last 10 years, it's been exciting to see all the progress with these two revolutions, the modern neurosciences revolution and the neural networks revolution, with brain-inspired models actually conquering AI. That is just so amazing. Um, and that gives us such great tools. But at the same time, we haven't learned how to connect our newfound big models to the big data we have now, right? We don't have a mature methodology for doing science and after these two amazing revolutions. And so we have to build that tool set, right? And we have to think about what does it even mean to understand how the brain works, how a brain works, how the human brain works, how the monkey brain works, how a fly brain works. So there are many interesting conceptual questions that border on the philosophical, and they bleed over into more methodological and statistical questions, like, how do we test hypotheses, right? So, we're thinking, well, if you have a computational hypothesis, it's not enough to just describe it in words. You have to build a neural network model. And then the very first test or the zeroth test is, does that neural network model work? Can it solve the cube? All the descriptions that can't actually solve the cube, they're not good theories of what goes on in your brain when you do solve the cube.
Yeah.
So that's great, right? So that is a major constraint because it throws out a lot of stories you could tell, and that
Yeah.
psychologists and neuroscientists have been telling about how the brain works without actually putting it to that test, right?
Right.
And then we need to figure out, once you have a smaller set of computational hypotheses, how do we empirically test them, right? Like, what do we have subjects do? Do we just take video of, people solving the cube? Or do we have a special cube that can sense exactly what state it's in, and then you have people solve it, So how do you get behavioral data? And then how do you get brain data, right? So for example, you think about how can you solve the cube in an fMRI scanner, functional MRI, while we measure your brain activity. That would be useful. Or you could think about doing EEG or MEG while you're
Yeah.
solving the cube to get brain activity data. That data is also very limited because it's averages across tens or hundreds of thousands of neurons, right? Still, there's a lot of information there in terms of the information per second that you're acquiring about brain activity. It's quite a lot, right? So we can compare representations between neural network models and brains by leveraging brain activity measurements of that kind. But we have to be very careful about the limitations of those measurements, and that has to inform how we evaluate different models, right? How do we then say, okay, these models both can solve the cube. This one better predicts the actual fine-grained patterns of behavior, and maybe better predicts the dynamics of representational transformations that we see when we measure brain activity, right? So figuring out how that research program is can even work, envisioning that is a huge part of what I'm interested in. And then I'm interested in applying that in the area of vision. And there I would say like what the most intriguing thing is what we touched on in the beginning, which is how the human visual system and the primate visual system more generally integrates a generative mode of perceptual inference with a discriminative mode and gets the best of both worlds. So combining the computational efficiency of a discriminative feed-forward system with the data efficiency of a more generative mode of inference. I think that the system has an algorithm that is sort of a synthesis of these two perspectives,
Hmm.
but they are rooted in different literatures. And for us, it's very difficult to, think of how to seamlessly combine them into, a single algorithm. And I think, we understood that algorithm, that would mean a major breakthrough also for AI, actually.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting. On that note, Dr. Kriegeskorte, thank you so much for joining me today. I had a very interesting time talking to you, and I'm really glad you have a lot to say about the Rubik's cubes and use them to kind of as an example, because I like to I like to do that a lot in my interviews, but you kind of did it for me here. So that
Mhm.
was very, very fun. And a lot of the concepts that you said, I'll definitely be thinking about as I speed cube and continue my journey with the Rubik's cubes and neuroscience as well. So thank you for joining me.
Wonderful. Good to see you, Sanjay. Keep in touch.
Yeah.